You are listening to the Tank Magazine podcast. In this episode, Aida Amoako talks with the American novelist Jesmyn Ward. Among her many accolades, Ward is a recipient of the Macarthur Genius Grant and the first female author to win 2 National Book Awards for fiction, the first for Salvage the Bones in 2011 and the second for her most recent novel, Sing Unburied Sing, in 2017. The subject of this conversation is The Fire This Time, which is a collection of essays and poetry edited by Ward and published in the UK this year. Inspired by James Baldwin's landmark essay The Fire Next Time, the collection reacts to recent tragedies and widespread protests across America and gives voice to a new generation of black writers addressing issues of race in the nation. The text version of this interview can be found in the Tank Summer Reader issue.
Okay, so you said that you turned to James Baldwin in desperation, and I was feeling like he's not the most comforting, so I was wondering what it was you were looking for from him.
He was the first writer of color who I found who was frank and unapologetic and who really told the truth as he saw it, and he seemed really fearless in his work. And so I think that that's what I wanted, from my reading at that time, because in America, especially when that was going, when after Trayvon Martin was killed, and we began to see like a succession of black people sort of killed, black men and women killed in really horrible ways. Every time something like that happened, the larger culture dominated the narrative about that person's death. The larger, specifically like white culture, dominated the conversation around their death, right? So they were tried for their deaths. And so I guess at that time, it was like very hard for me to find a person of color, or someone from marginalized community or marginalized group talking about what was happening and in the same vein as James Baldwin, right? So somebody who was like unapologetic and fierce and frank. And I guess that just means that those voices are out there, right? Yeah. And so it just means at that time they didn't have the reach, that Baldwin has, because even though he's not here, his work has been available and has been and widely read, for decades. So that's why I think I looked for him and looked to him, because it was hard for me to find, that voice in the present, I guess.
So after reading The Fire Next Time and wanting to kind of look for this generation's thinkers and writers, I was you said, I think, to puzzle this out. And I thought it was interesting that your instinct was to gather many voices as opposed to sort of going it alone. I was wondering what was behind the desire to sort of go for, collect voices together.
Well, first because I found the writing of my memoir, which is creative nonfiction, that was very difficult for me because I believe that memoir and that essay writing requires a certain amount of introspection and honesty and clarity that is very difficult for me to attain in my work. And it's something that I have to work very hard at. Like, naturally, I don't plot everything before I write it. I'm not accustomed to having to make myself into a narrator and into a character. And then I'm also not accustomed to having to, assess myself so closely, right? Because I'm more comfortable in fiction. And so I didn't want to take on a book-length project on my own. And I'm also very aware of the fact that I don't have all the answers. I have not studied and read as much history as I should have at this point in my life. And so I definitely don't have the tools that I would need to make a lot of the connections that I think many of the writers made in The Fire This Time. You know what I'm saying? Like, especially many of the historians who, wrote pieces and contributed pieces. And so, so I recognize that there are a plethora of voices and thinkers and writers out there who are doing really important work. This wasn't a project that I really wanted to pursue by myself. Like I wanted to to bring these different voices together, and some of them were beginning writers at the time and just starting out. So for them, I really wanted to be the gatekeeper who opens the gate and provides them a platform, so that their work can get out there. And then for the writers who are well established and well known, like Natasha Trethewey, and with writers like that, I wanted to just amplify their voices, I guess.
Yeah. How would you describe the relationship between The Fire Next Time and The Fire This Time? Would you say it was an homage, a sequel, a response?
The Fire This Time is something of an homage, and I also think that it contains multiple replies in a conversation that I hope that we're having, not only with Baldwin, but with other people of color, in the United States. And then also, beyond the, various communities of color in the United States, because, there's only so much change that I believe that we can achieve on our own. We, definitely need to, work with allies and then also be sort of, I guess, pushy and what's a better word? Be sort of, like pushy and not confrontational, but just be challenging with people who aren't allies,
Yeah. I've heard it described as an essay collection, but it's got poems and creative nonfiction as well. How did you go about deciding what kind of content would go in the book?
Well, so at the very beginning we said, because I was like talking about the book with my editor, this book was a very collaborative effort, I think, between me and my editor. So we were talking about it, and I said, well, why would it be interesting because I love poetry, and it seemed that at the time that every day I was discovering a new, a black poet who I loved, right? And so I asked my editor, I said, well, because we were talking about the possible structure of the book, right? Because when we were thinking about writers to solicit for work, we just came to this decision that we would say, well, we were wondering if you'd be, willing to contribute to this anthology about race in America, right? And so it was super open-ended, and we were going to ask, people who wrote essays, who wrote creative nonfiction. And then because I was finding so many poems and so much good poetry, that I liked, I thought, well, why can't poets be a part of this too? Because much of the poetry that I was encountering was really wrestling with police brutality, with really like what it meant to be black, in America at that time, right? And so I just, I thought, well, wouldn't that be cool if we could actually get some poets to contribute pieces so that this would, it wouldn't just be an essay collection or a collection of creative nonfiction. It would be, there would be some poetry in there too. So we ended up adding in some poets, who we knew and whose work we loved, and we just asked them to contribute.
The idea of myth, I noticed, runs through The Fire This Time. You talk about in the introduction the South as a place where the old myths still hold a special place in many white hearts. And I was wondering, could you expand on what those myths are?
I've read this before, and in some ways I think that it is true. So one time I read, I think someone on Twitter said it too, they said, ideologically the South won the Civil War, the American Civil War. And so I can't take credit for that statement. I won't. When I read it, I was so struck by it because I began thinking about, the fact that Black Americans, both men and women, are perceived as such threats that they can be murdered by policemen, by people in power. And those people in power, policemen, are never held accountable for those deaths. I mean, I can't think of an example off the top of my head where a policeman or policewoman was actually held accountable for killing, a black man or black woman in a police shooting, right? Or strangling, or, whatever, right? Killing a black person in a violent manner. And I think that's, that reflects that myth, that one of the myths that was so popular in the South, especially right after the Civil War, right? And we could probably trace it back before slavery, that, these people are subhuman and they're dangerous, right? And so the larger culture is sort of carrying this belief forward, and here we see it acted out again and again in situations like that. I think there are other myths, like black people in general just being worth less, and black lives being worth less than white lives, and being less important. And I feel like I see that in so many of the institutions, in the South, in the disparities in education, disparities in healthcare, the disparities in wealth distribution. You know what I'm saying? Like the fact that so many generations of African Americans and black people in the South have just lived in poverty, and how that's sort of handed down through generations, and why that's handed down in generations, because we were explicitly denied access, to programs put in place by the federal government in the New Deal to lift people up out of poverty. I can see these beliefs, right, that were used to justify slavery of people of African descent. And I can see how, as I get older and as I read more history and as I learn, it's clearer and clearer for me to see the ways that those ideas, the ideas that were used to justify slavery, that they have strengthened and exist in the present moment, and the way that they express themselves. And I believe not only in the South, I just feel like it's more perhaps overt and perhaps more deeply entrenched in the South than in perhaps the North or the West, right? Or the Southwest or the Midwest. But, I don't know. I think that those myths permeate the whole country.
Yeah. And in the fire next time, Baldwin kind of suggests that progress is only really within reach if white people divest themselves of these myths, but that they either are ignorant of that or slow to act, reluctant. And I was wondering what you thought of the idea that progress might rely on people having to want to, I guess, turn their world upside down.
I mean, I think he's exactly right, because in order to acknowledge the humanity of others and elevate them, and I think that's part of what, unfortunately, we're dealing with right now in the United States, right? And I guess across Europe, I mean, there's this anti-democratic, fascist, racist, transphobic, homophobic, all the obics and isms, right? Yeah. And in part, I feel like that's those kinds of people reacting to this idea that, or I guess being wrong in believing in this idea that inclusivity means that they're losing something. Their rights are being taken away, and they're being made into victims, and all the stupid things that they believe, and then they react in the violent way that they've reacted. I don't know. I think Baldwin is very right, because they'd have to recognize their privilege, and they'd have to realize how they're positioned and the power that they have and the society that exists, how it has been built, through centuries to benefit them. And they'd have to acknowledge that. And I feel like there's this call for everyone to really recognize their privilege, right? Whatever their privilege is. You might benefit from multiple types of privilege, I guess. But I think that, that white society in America definitely has to recognize their privilege in order for change to occur, or progress to occur. Yeah. And I think they're very resistant to that right now, I mean, growing up, that was one of the things that I encountered, backwards ideas about race and about the Civil War and about what the South was really fighting for in the Civil War, and this like weird defanging of slavery. You know what I'm saying? Like this weird retelling of slavery where it was like this benign institution, which I guess has existed since, slavery in America was legal, since before the passage of the 13th Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. There were these, slave holders in the South like to cast themselves as these like benevolent patriarchs, right? And they were doing us a favor by bringing us over as guest workers, apparently. And those, again, if we're talking about myths, like those myths persist. And so it really is an uphill battle, I feel like, for the kind of writers who are in my, who took part in the fire this time, for the many writers who did not, but who are sort of pushing back against, against these myths and against this larger, closed-minded society, I guess.
And you wrote that you believe in the power of words. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's how, I guess, would one goal to be to overwrite those myths with new myths? Because some would argue that countries do need like a driving myth behind them. Mm-hmm. Or is it to just completely break down, destroy myths and have everybody sort of live, with just like pure reality?
No, I think that we tell stories because stories help us impose order on our lives, right? And they help us impose order on events, and they give those events meaning. And I think it's really difficult to exist without that. That's why I think it's such like an important human tradition, right? To tell stories. So I think that we need our stories, but I think that we need to be perhaps more inclusive with the stories that we tell. And I think that if we are more inclusive with the stories that we tell, that the conversation that we're having, about what it means to be a human being will change and will evolve, and will hopefully that will hopefully lead to more change. I at one time in my mid-20s, I had never actually read any of Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches before, and so in my mid-20s I read some of his speeches in the class, and because I was a teaching assistant for this college course, and so in the class the professor, she began to talk about sympathy, right, and how there are certain parts in each of his speeches where he makes the whatever injustice he is talking about, he makes it personal in order to paint a clearer picture of who he is as a human being, in order to create a clear picture of the people around him as human beings, like his children, right, when he talks about his children in his speeches, right? And the purpose of that is to make the audience, the listener, feel sympathy, right, and empathy, and see him as a human being, and in doing so persuade the listener and the audience to his way of thinking. I say all that to say that I think that if there are more stories that are inclusive and that are written about a variety of experiences, that I think that we can't, when we share those stories, I think that we can't help but feel empathy for each other and feel sympathy for each other. And I believe that it expands, that empathy and that sympathy expands our definition of humanity, really. And I think that that's the way to change, right? I think that you have to see, this person who has an alien experience, a very different experience from the one that you have. If you feel some empathy for them, then you feel for them, and you see them as a human being, right? You see them as a complicated person. And I think that that then you don't want them to hurt. You don't want them to, what I'm saying? And so I feel like that, so I feel like storytelling and words and myth making, I feel like all of that is very important to creating the kind of lasting change and transformation that that we definitely all want.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.